The land stretched wide and flat, a mix of tall grass, red soil, and scattered clusters of oak that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. To someone driving past, it might have looked like empty country, just another patch of ground in a state where land rolled on for miles. But to the man who owned it, that soil carried more than just roots. It carried history. His father had worked this land, his grandfather before him, and stories even spoke of a great-grandfather who'd tilled the same ground with calloused hands after the chains had finally been broken. Every acre held memory. Every fence post, every bend of the creek that cut through the property reminded him that what he owned wasn't just dirt. It was blood, sweat, and legacy. For years, the place had been quiet, a pocket of peace tucked away from the rush of cities and the world's noise. His house sat modest and weathered, white paint peeling on its sides, the porch creaking beneath every step. A dog used to lie in the shade of the steps, tail wagging lazily in the heat, while chickens wandered across the yard. He lived simply, the kind of life that didn't catch much attention. Days were spent fixing fences, walking the fields, or staring out at the water from the dam his father had built decades ago. That dam was the heart of the land, holding back the river that could otherwise eat the fields alive. Without it, the land would drown. With it, the land thrived. It was more than just rock and concrete. It was control. At first, he noticed the changes in whispers. A survey truck parked on the side of the road, strangers walking with clipboards. A line of coloured stakes was hammered into the earth not far from his fence. Then came the papers in the mailbox, letters heavy with words that bent laws to the will of those with money. They spoke of development, of housing for new families, of progress. What they didn't speak of was him, the man whose family had lived there for generations, the man whose name was on the deed. His land was suddenly worth more to them than his history, more to their pockets than his bloodline. The people behind those letters didn't come knocking on his door. They didn't look him in the eye. They sent their lawyers, their agents, their polished words written in language sharp enough to cut. He resisted at first, stubborn and rooted like the oaks that stood near the creek. But resistance takes energy, and the years had weighed heavily on him. What was once his by birthright began to feel like it was slipping, inch by inch, under his boots. By the time the trucks came, there was little he could do but watch. Machines dug into the earth, tearing into the land like it had never been alive. Steel frames rose where grass once swayed. The air was filled with the sound of hammers, saws, and engines. What had once been a place of quiet became a construction zone, a constant reminder that what was his was being rewritten before his eyes. They carved roads where he used to walk at sunset. They named cul-de-sacs after trees they'd cut down. They didn't see him. They didn't want to. To them, he was just a shadow of the past, someone who had been outpaced by their vision of the future. But he watched. He kept his silence, standing by the dam some nights as the moonlight spread silver over the water. The dam was old but strong, built to withstand storms, built to protect. Yet, as he stood there, staring at the weight of the water it held back, he realized something the developers never considered. They had built their homes below it, pretty little houses with trimmed lawns and fresh paint, lined up like teeth in the earth. Families moved in with boxes and laughter, children riding bikes in the cul-de-sac. To them it was safe, a perfect community rising from the ground. They didn't see the dam. They didn't think about the river, about what it meant to hold back nature with stone. The Homeowners Association came together fast, as they always did in these places. Rules were written, fees were set, and meetings were held in shiny new clubhouses. Power shifted into their hands, and with power came arrogance. They looked at the man as an obstacle, a reminder of something they didn't control. They sent letters that grew sharper in tone. They threatened. They fined. They talked about easements and access rights. They believed their rules stretched beyond their neatly drawn streets, into the land they hadn't bought, into the soil they didn't own. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm into their meetings. He simply listened, nodded, and carried on with his days. But behind the quiet, something was shifting inside him. He had lost before. Land, respect, even the sense of peace his father once had out here. But he had never been stripped of dignity the way they stripped it from him now. They mocked his claims. They doubted his history. They thought the law was theirs to bend, the water theirs to ignore. And so, while their houses stood bright and proud, while their lawns were watered and their children laughed, he stood by the dam in silence. The river pressed heavy behind the wall, a force waiting, patient, always stronger than stone. It was his inheritance, his secret, his last card. He knew one truth they had never considered. Everything they had built stood on land that could be swallowed whole in a single night. It started small, the kind of small you could almost miss if you weren't paying attention. A note taped to his fence with official-looking lettering. It told him his grass along the edge of the development was unsightly and needed to be trimmed to preserve the community's aesthetic. He read it twice, holding the paper in hands that had worked this soil for decades. His grass, his fence, his land. He didn't reply, didn't send a word back. He crumpled the letter and burned it in the rusted barrel near his porch. But that was the first time he felt it, the heat rising in his chest, the sense that these people weren't just neighbors. They were intruders, and they weren't going to stop. Soon it wasn't just notes. A woman from the HOA came to his door, smiling too widely, clipboard in hand, speaking with the tone of someone who thought they were above him. She told him his animals needed to be relocated because their noise and smell didn't fit with the new, family-friendly environment. He stood on his porch, saying nothing, just listening. His silence unsettled her. She left quickly, heels clicking against his gravel path, but she came back weeks later with 2 men in suits who tried to pressure him into selling. They offered him less than the land was worth, as if they thought he was too old to know better, too tired to fight. The more he refused, the more hostile they became. At night, car lights would sweep across his windows, slowing down near his driveway. He found trash tossed over his fence, glass bottles broken in his fields. A group of boys, sons of the new homeowners, drove their bikes across his land, laughing as they tore through his crops. When he asked them to leave, their parents accused him of harassing children. Letters from the HOA became more frequent, citing violations on property they didn't even own. Each word was like a nail driven deeper into his patience. Money made their arrogance possible. These new families had come from cities, buying into the dream of wide-open space, selling their cramped apartments for a piece of countryside. They had savings, salaries, and the confidence that came from knowing the law usually bent toward people like them. He, on the other hand, had none of that. Farming didn't make much anymore. His income was modest enough to keep the lights on and food in the pantry, but not enough to fight lawyers. What little savings he had were tied to the land itself. They knew it. They thought they could starve him out, bleed him dry until he had no choice but to sell. Still, he held on. He held on because he had seen his father fight harder battles with less. He held on because giving up meant giving them everything. But holding on came at a cost. Nights grew restless. He sat on the porch smoking until the stars blurred overhead, thinking about the weight of the water in the dam, about how easily everything could change if he wanted it to. He began walking the dam more often, not just to check for cracks like he always did, but to think. The sound of rushing water on the other side became a rhythm in his head, steady, heavy, constant. The tension grew worse when the HOA decided to build a walking trail near the creek, cutting too close to the edge of his land. He found them hammering signs into the soil, signs that read, "Private property, HOA members only." his property. He pulled the signs out of the ground and left them stacked at the edge of their road. Days later, more appeared. This time, someone spray-painted a threat on his fence. Sell, or else. The sheriff came out once after he called about the vandalism, but the deputy who showed up was young, polite, and unhelpful. He looked over the spray paint and said, "Hard to prove who did it. Best let it be." The man could see it in his eyes. No one was going to help him. The law wasn't on his side. The HOA had lawyers, money, and connections. He had only his land and the dam. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the storm building inside him. To them, he was just an old man too stubborn to move on. But in his silence, in his slow nods and his quiet watching, something darker was forming. He thought often of his grandfather, who had told him stories about the fight it took to keep this land when others wanted it. He thought of the anger in his father's voice when he'd say, "Never let them take what's ours." Those voices felt alive again, whispering in his ears as he walked the property lines, reminding him that history was repeating itself. The homeowners weren't unified either. Behind their polished smiles and manicured lawns, cracks were forming. Some families wanted peace, tired of the letters and the drama. Others, especially the ones who sat on the HOA board, wanted control. Power made them bold, made them petty. They gossiped about him in their meetings, calling him dangerous, unstable. Rumors spread through the development that he carried a shotgun, that he threatened children, that he was a problem who needed to be handled. Each rumor pulled him further away from being seen as a man and closer to being seen as an obstacle. He knew they didn't fear him yet. They laughed at him in their yards, pointed when he walked past in town, and lowered their voices when he entered the hardware store. That was when he started to fear himself, because the longer he stayed quiet, the more he thought about what he could do. Not what he should, but what he could. Each humiliation, each trespass, each smirk they gave him, it all gathered like storm clouds pressing against the dam in his chest. By the time the development finished its 35th home, the neighborhood looked neat, ordered, perfect on the surface, but beneath it ran a tension so thick it hummed in the air. He rarely spoke to anyone anymore. Neighbors kept their distance, except when sending threats wrapped in legal terms. Children were told to stay away from the old man's place. The line had been drawn. Every night, he walked to the dam. He stood there in silence, listening to the water groan against the wall. He began to see it not as a shield, but as a weapon, one he had been guarding all his life without realizing it. The more the HOA pressed him, the more the thought returned. One move, one choice, and everything they built is gone. The man they had dismissed as powerless, voiceless, began to feel the weight of the power he did have. Not money, not laws, but water. The one thing they could never buy or control. He imagined the river pouring through their cul-de-sacs, swallowing their lawns, tearing up their polished streets, flooding their perfect houses. And instead of fear, he felt calm. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one at their mercy. They were at his. The night it happened, the sky pressed down heavily, swollen with clouds that threatened rain but never released it. The air was thick, the kind that clung to skin, carrying the smell of earth and the faint musk of water waiting behind the dam. He sat on his porch longer than usual, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, the glow sparking against the darkness. He hadn't planned it for that night, not in any deliberate way, but the silence around him carried an edge he couldn't shake. It was as though the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to move. The last letter still sat on his kitchen table, unopened but already read in his mind. He knew its words before he slit it open. Demands, threats, legal action, fines he could never pay. They wanted him gone, and they would keep pushing until the land wasn't his anymore. His hand trembled as he looked at it, not from fear, but from rage, so deep it shook him from the inside out. He thought of his father, the dam, the words, "Never let them take what's ours." That weight, that inheritance, boiled inside him until there was only one thing left to do. He rose slowly, his bones aching, but his steps steady. The flashlight beam cut through the night as he walked the familiar path to the dam. Crickets chirped loudly, an endless chorus broken by the occasional splash of something moving in the creek. The closer he got, the louder the water sounded, as if it were already awake, already hungry. He placed his hand on the concrete wall, cool and damp beneath his palm. For years, he had stood here to protect, to guard, to make sure this barrier never failed. Tonight, he came for the opposite. The lever was rusted, stiff from disuse, but it was still there, hidden behind the panel his father had taught him to use. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the knowledge that this moment could not be undone. His fingers curled around the metal. For a second he hesitated. He thought of the families in those houses, children asleep in their beds, parents who had only wanted a home. He thought of whether they deserved this, whether his anger was enough to justify what was about to happen. But then he saw the spray paint on his fence, the letters calling him out, the laughter of men who thought they had won. And in that moment, mercy felt like betrayal. The lever groaned as it shifted, the sound deep and ancient, like the earth itself waking. The dam shuddered. A vibration ran through the wall into his hands, and then the water began to move. At first it was a trickle, a hiss, a thin stream slipping free. Then it roared, the gates giving way, the river surging forward with a violence that made the ground tremble. He staggered back as the force of it rushed past, white froth crashing against rock, the sound drowning out everything else. Down below, the development slept. Lights flickered in windows. Shadows moved behind curtains. They had no warning. The first wave hit the edge of the cul-de-sac like a beast, tearing through wood and glass. Lawns vanished under a sheet of black water. Cars floated, spinning like toys. The sound of breaking glass, shouts, screams. They rose up into the night, mixing with the thunder of the river. People poured out of their houses, barefoot, clutching children, their voices sharp with panic. "What's happening?" "The water! The dam! Run!" He watched from above, standing in the shadows, the spray from the river cooling his face. His heart hammered, but his body felt strangely calm, almost numb. The sight was unreal. Roofs torn away, walls crumbling, the perfect neighborhood sinking beneath the flood. It wasn't quick. The water dragged everything out, twisting it, ripping it apart piece by piece. He could hear the desperation in their cries, the raw terror of people who had believed they were safe. For a moment, he thought of running down, of trying to pull someone out, but his feet never moved. He stayed, rooted, as if his soul had fused with the earth itself. The faces of the families burned into his mind, mothers clutching babies, fathers wading chest deep, kids screaming as the water pulled them away. The guilt came sharp, stabbing at him, but it was swallowed by the deeper satisfaction there. It pulsed through his chest. They had built their lives on what wasn't theirs, and now the river had taken it back. He whispered to himself, not even realizing he was speaking, "It was never yours. It was never yours." In the chaos below, some fought to climb onto rooftops, waving flashlights, their beams flickering like fireflies against the dark. Others screamed names into the night, voices breaking with fear. He could smell the wet wood, the gas from broken lines, the sharp bite of something burning. The neighborhood, so carefully crafted, was no longer a place of order. It were ruined in, swallowed whole by a force older and stronger than any of them. Minutes stretched like hours. The water spread, slower now but unrelenting, filling streets, pushing through doorways. The screams dulled, swallowed by distance and the endless roar of the river. When it finally began to quiet, when the flood had done its work, only the sound of rushing water remained. The development was unrecognizable. Houses stood broken, their walls sagging, their lights dark. Cars were piled against fences. Trees leaned at impossible angles. Silence pressed down heavily, broken only by sobs that drifted from the survivors. He stood there, breathing hard, his chest tight as though the air itself had thickened. For the first time, he realized what he had done. Not in theory, not in anger, but in reality. Lives had been swept away, people who had never raised a hand against him. Innocent children, who had never written a letter or driven stakes into his land. His legs buckled, and he leaned against the dam, closing his eyes. The satisfaction flickered and faded, replaced by something heavier, darker. He told himself it was justice. He told himself they forced his hand. But beneath those words, the truth cut deep. He had crossed a line that could never be walked back. The dam still roared, the river still spilled into the land below. But now the sound felt different. Not like freedom, not like power. It sounded like the end of everything. The morning after, the land no longer looked like the place he had known all his life. The neighborhood below the dam was a wasteland of mud, broken wood, and silence. What had once been streets filled with neat houses and trimmed lawns was now a swamp of shattered walls and overturned cars. A child's bicycle leaned against a tree, bent and half buried in silt. Curtains clung to branches like ghosts. The air smelled of gasoline, damp earth, and something metallic that hung heavy in the throat. The water still moved sluggishly, receding, but it had already done its work. Lives were lost, homes were destroyed, and nothing about that place could ever be called a community again. For hours, no one spoke his name. The survivors, soaked, shivering, clinging to what little was left, were too stunned to think about blame. They were searching, calling names, wading chest-deep through muck to find loved ones. Some found them alive, others found nothing but silence. The cries of grief rose into the morning like a chorus of broken voices. The flood had stripped away everything but raw survival. He stood at a distance watching. His boots were covered in mud, his shirt soaked through with sweat, though he hadn't lifted more than the lever. He told himself he should leave, disappear before the questions came, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted in place, staring at what he had done, trying to decide whether it felt like justice or ruin. At first his mind reached for excuses. They pushed me. They mocked me. They tried to erase me. The words spun like a shield around his conscience, but the shield cracked quickly. Every time his eyes caught a child's toy, floating in the water, every time he heard a voice scream in anguish, his chest tightened. He wanted to believe he had done what needed to be done. But what kind of justice drowned the innocent alongside the guilty? By noon, the sheriff's deputies were there, boots sloshing in the mud, radios crackling. Ambulances screamed down the broken roads, carrying away the few they could save. The townspeople gathered at the edges of the wreckage, their faces pale, their voices low, as if they were afraid the water might rise again if they spoke too loudly. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the storm broke the dam. Others whispered that it had been sabotaged. His name floated among them, quiet at first, then louder, until it carried a weight of certainty. When they came to his house, he didn't run. He sat on the porch, hands resting on his knees, staring out at the fields as if they still belonged to him. The deputies asked him to stand. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He said only one thing as they cuffed him, his voice flat. They took everything. No one replied. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut, was the only answer he got. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the county line. News vans crowded the roads, reporters with microphones and sharp voices asking questions no one could answer. The footage of the neighborhood, houses shattered, families wading through waist-deep water, children wrapped in blankets, eyes wide with shock, ran on every channel. His name was plastered on the screen, always tied to the words killer, saboteur, domestic terrorist. Some called him a monster. Others called him a symbol of defiance against the wealthy. But no one called him a farmer anymore. No one called him a neighbor, or a son, or a man. The survivors struggled to reconcile what had happened. Some refused to believe it was deliberate, insisting the dam had failed because it was old. After all, nature had simply done what it always does. Believing in an accident was easier than believing someone had chosen to unleash the flood. Others wanted blood. They demanded the harshest punishment, their grief sharpening into fury. They pointed at him not just as the man who pulled the lever, but as the embodiment of every resentment they had ever faced. The weight of it pressed down on him even in the cell. At night, the screams replayed in his head, sharper than the clanging of doors or the buzz of lights. He saw faces he didn't know, faces he had seen only for a second as the water swallowed them. He tried to tell himself it was necessary, that it was the only way to make them understand. But guilt is a stubborn thing. It seeped into his bones like the river into soil. Sleep offered no relief. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the water again, heard the roar, felt the spray on his skin. Back in town, people who had once ignored him couldn't stop talking about him. Old neighbors remembered his father, remembered the quiet pride of a family that had held on to land through every storm of history. They asked themselves how a man like that had become this. Some said he had gone mad from loneliness, eaten away by bitterness. Others said he had been pushed too far, crushed by greed until violence was the only thing left. The truth was less clear. It was both and neither, tangled in the messy threads of anger, injustice, and despair. Families of the dead buried their loved ones in small, crowded cemeteries. Funerals filled the air with hymns, prayers, and sobs. The new community that was supposed to stand as a model of progress became a monument to loss. Property values sank, investors pulled out. The development stopped growing. People moved away, leaving half-built homes to rot in the mud. What was meant to be a shining neighborhood was now a scar on the land, a place no one wanted to remember but no one could forget. And in the quiet moments, long after the sirens stopped, after the reporters moved on, after the trials and hearings began, the ones who stayed behind wrestled with their reflection in the tragedy. Some whispered that maybe they had pushed too hard, that maybe if they had shown him respect, if they had left him his dignity, things would have been different. Others silenced that thought, clinging to anger because it was easier than guilt. But the question lingered in the air. Did they help write the ending they now mourned? The man himself spoke little after that day. In court he sat still, eyes lowered, letting the lawyers argue over his fate. The only words he offered were simple and unchanging. It was mine. Whether it was madness or truth, no one could decide. What he had destroyed wasn't just property or lives. It was trust, the fragile thread that binds people together in a place they call home. Once it snapped, nothing could stitch it whole again. The trial stretched on for months, dragging the story through every courtroom, every newspaper, every nightly broadcast. The man sat through it quietly, his posture steady, but his face hollowed by the weight of what he had done. Witnesses testified, experts explained the mechanics of the dam, and survivors recounted the terror of that night. Each word piled higher, a mountain of evidence no one could climb. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole. He nodded when the judge spoke, as if he had expected nothing less. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy. In the end, the law had spoken, and he accepted it in silence. For the families of the dead, the verdict was both a relief and a hollow victory. Justice, in its legal sense, had been served, but the truth was harsher. No sentence could return the children swept away. No prison walls could fill the empty chairs at their tables. For them, the ruling was an ending only on paper. Their real lives carried the weight of loss that stretched beyond the courtroom, into every quiet morning, every restless night. The community fractured in the aftermath. The neighborhood that had once been sold as a dream of progress became a shadow of itself. Some families stayed, clinging stubbornly to what little they had left, but many left, unable to live where the water had taken so much. The HOA dissolved in disgrace. Its board members mocked in the press for their arrogance and greed, though none were held legally responsible. They were left to face their reputations, tarnished forever by the disaster they had helped fuel. His land, the soil his family had fought to keep for generations, was seized by the state as part of the legal settlement. It was no longer his, nor was it theirs. It became government property, fenced off, patrolled, a reminder of what happens when human pride collides with the raw power of nature. The dam, too, was dismantled, its stones broken and hauled away. The river flowed freely now, cutting through the land with no barriers, as though it had claimed its justice in the end. For him, prison was both punishment and escape. The silence of the cell became a strange comfort after the chaos. He spent hours staring at the wall, lost in thoughts that never quieted. Sometimes he told himself he had done what he had to do, that the world had cornered him until violence was his only way out. Other times he saw only the faces of the children, the voices of the drowned, and guilt carved into him like stone. There was no peace in either version of the story. He carried both truths at once, a man torn between pride and regret until the end of his days. The broader world looked at the case with mixed eyes. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when resentment festers unchecked. Others, especially those who shared his history, whispered that his rage was not born in a vacuum. They saw in him the echoes of centuries of struggle, of land taken and voices silenced, of dignity eroded piece by piece. They did not excuse him, but they understood how a man could come to believe that destruction was the only form of justice left. Laws changed in the aftermath. New regulations were passed for dam safety and new oversight for developments near waterways. The government tightened its grip to ensure nothing like this could happen again. Yet laws could not reach into the hearts of people, could not erase the deeper questions the story left behind. Who truly held power, and who was always at risk of losing everything? What lines exist between justice and revenge, between dignity and destruction? The story forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Pride can be as dangerous as greed. Silence can be as destructive as violence. When one side takes without listening and the other suffers without speaking, the gap between them widens until something breaks. In this case, it was stone and water. But beneath it all, it was people, their flaws, their stubbornness, their need to hold power over each other, that led to the flood. His life ended not on his land, not under the open sky he had known since boyhood, but in the narrow space of a cell. He left no family behind, no heirs to carry the name, no one to remember him with love. What remained of him was his story, told and retold, debated and dissected, a grim reminder of how far a man can fall when stripped of everything he believes is his. And yet, for all its tragedy, the story did not vanish. It lingered because it touched something universal, the fragile balance between power and powerlessness, between belonging and exclusion, between being seen and being erased. It showed how greed can dress itself as progress, how justice can turn into vengeance, and how easily a single act can ripple outward, drowning not only those it touches directly, but everyone standing nearby. In the end, there were no true winners. The homeowners lost their homes, their families, their futures. The man lost his freedom, his legacy, his soul. The land lost its peace, scarred forever by violence. And society lost another chance to bridge the divide before it broke into disaster. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind, that when power is used to silence instead of listen, when dignity is stripped instead of honored, when resentment is left to rot instead of healed, the dam always breaks, whether in water or blood.